What are they booing about? I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks. This is Ron Purser in San Francisco at San Francisco State University, and my colleague.
That would be me. I'm David Forbes. I'm at Brooklyn College and also at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City.
And we're very pleased today to have C.W. Huntington, also goes by the name of Sandy, from the Department of Religious Studies at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, upstate New York. So, welcome, Sandy. We're very happy to have you on the Mindful Cranks.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here.
One of the reasons why we wanted to have you on the Mindful Cranks was because of the article you published called The Triumph of Narcissism, Theravada Buddhist Meditation in the Marketplace, which appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion in September of 2015. It made such an impression on me that I probably have read it 4 to 5 times now. And, of course, we started our correspondence as a result of that article. And but before we get into getting into the nitty-gritty of that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you do at Hartwick and perhaps how you got into the field of Buddhist studies. That might be an interesting place to start.
Okay, sure. So let's say 3 minutes here, the short version.
Sure, yes.
Just to get a time frame. At Hartwick, I'm in a religious studies department, and it's a small liberal arts college. So I pretty much cover everything that qualifies in anyone's imagination here as either religion or philosophy east of, in Asia, excluding the Near East with Islam and so forth. So, I'm like most people who teach on the faculty of a small liberal arts college, I do a lot of different things here. But when I put on my going outside of the small liberal arts world and my Buddhist studies cap, I have, for some years, most of my publication and my kind of specialty was in Mahayana and is in still Mahayana Buddhism, Indian Mahayana, with a focus on Madhyamaka. So I've done a lot of publication in that area and over the years. But I also, in terms of language work, I read Pali and Tibetan and a little bit of Chinese sometimes when I need to. So that takes me out into a slightly broader world, and especially with the Pali text, that brings me into the Theravada world. And I have a great interest in Indian Buddhism in particular, and in terms of Theravada Buddhism, I have also a personal interest, I would say, in Theravada meditation practice. I've practiced forms of meditation in that tradition, more or less loosely defined as mindfulness, for years. So there's a personal and you might say, scholarly connection here.
Mm-hmm. And you spent quite a few years in India, off and on, haven't you?
Yes. Beginning as a young graduate student in my 20s, I started going to India, and initially, my first day, I was there for almost 4 years. I just really, I fell in love with India and contemporary Indian culture, as well as the classical culture of philosophy and the textual tradition. So yeah, and then after that, I've been back many times over the years for stays of anywhere from a month to periods of years. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a good lead-in to some of our mutual concerns that I think your article has raised. One of the things that struck me immediately was that you said fairly early on in this article that the early research that was happening on Vipassana meditation was much more nuanced compared to the more recent literature we're seeing in the psychotherapeutic literature on mindfulness, and that to me really struck a chord for me. I wanted to perhaps start by going back to something you said, a quotation. You told the story in the beginning of the article that you were on a month-long Buddhist meditation retreat in Bodh Gaya.
Mm-hmm.
And you said someone had the gumption in that retreat to ask the teacher if he was enlightened.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And his response was very interesting. And I'll read from it. The teacher responded, "I have never been enlightened. I am not enlightened, and I will never be enlightened." Sounds rather cone-like. And what did you make of that when you heard that?
Well, as I believe I wrote in the article, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I believe I said at the time, it really struck me, for maybe, at least in some sense, obvious reasons. That is, those of us who practice Buddhism and study it perhaps as well, we imagine enlightenment to be a possibility somehow, at least, and even if we don't really necessarily know what to make of it. And there is obviously a lot to be said about what enlightenment might be. But still, it sounds at least on one level like what this meditation teacher, a person who's practiced, in this case, Theravada Buddhist meditation for years and years, and is saying that enlightenment is an impossibility. And but then on a slightly more subtle level, maybe that's not exactly what he was saying. So I found it to be a very interesting statement, and it certainly captured my attention. I don't know how the other people in the retreat pictured it or made sense of it. But for me, it as I kind of parsed it from the point of view of my knowledge of the tradition and the Pali tradition, and especially from the point of view of the central teaching of not just the Pali tradition, but of all of Buddhism, really, arguably, and that is the teaching of no self. That's the teaching that distinguishes Buddhism in the Indian context, and from that perspective, it made sense to me, and it made sense because there's no real personal self. From that perspective, the sense of individuality that we normally stake our identity on in Theravada Buddhism is considered to be, in some sense, an illusion, or a construct, maybe is better from the Theravadan point of view, and understanding how there is no ultimately real individual identity. In other words, that identity is a construct of various components, elements. That is, in some sense, what constitutes enlightenment. So you're faced with an oxymoron, and I can't be enlightened. And I had never really conceptualized it in quite so stark terms. And when he gave that answer, I was really struck how he captured a very profound teaching in a very simple and somewhat disconcerting few words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think that the hook in the story it is almost like a koan or reminds me of a kind of a Yiddish joke where the emphasis is changed in terms of how it's said, but most people would hear it as I'm not enlightened, I've never been enlightened, but it's really I am not enlightened. I will never be enlightened. So there's a real shift there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think
it's not a simple thing. I mean, I just unpacked it here in response to your question, my initial response. But if you dig deeper, there are real tensions in the tradition around this, and they're reflected in the language, and they're also reflected in the Theravada tradition, and it's true in all Buddhist traditions, that there are levels of teaching, levels of language use, and they're more or less subtle. But they're all ultimately upaya, or skillful means. And the language in that sense is always used to direct one towards an experience, the nature of which escapes language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that brings up why we're interested in looking at this term mindfulness, which now is bandied about fairly willy-nilly. And your article goes back to the Theravada Buddhist tradition in a way that it seems like you are retracing the meaning of what Vipassana meditation, trying to distinguish it perhaps from other forms of meditation. But perhaps maybe a good question might be, could you maybe just try to briefly explain what distinguishes Vipassana within the Buddhist soteriological context?
Distinguishes Vipassana from other forms of meditation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you raise in the article that shamatha or samatha is calm-abiding meditation, which seems to be what's been adopted by a lot of therapeutic applications of mindfulness.
Right.
And I think that that's a really key point in this whole article is how you're really trying to parse out Vipassana, especially as you go back to some of the early research by Westerners in this area.
Right. All right. Well,
yeah.
I mean, there's a relatively quick response to that, and then there's the unpacking. But the quick response is the term vipassana in Pali. Pasana from pasati means to see, and the V is a prefix, and vipassana, it has the sense of insight, seeing into insight, and a particular insight that is, in this case, into the nature of, you might say, reality from the Theravada Buddhist point of view. Whereas, as you already mentioned, samatha in Pali and shamatha in Sanskrit is it's often translated as calm abiding. But however it's translated, it doesn't have that characteristic flavor of insight that Vipassana does. In other words, samatha meditation, and there are many, many different ways to practice samatha, they're all about concentration, using the concentrated mind, the focused mind, focused attention on a single object, and that object can be a visual or audio or lots of things.
Right.
But the point is to focus attention, and through that focus of attention, to gradually attain a level of calmness or tranquility, or whatever adjective you use. But the vipassana on the other side of this, the insight meditation, is traditionally, just by virtue of the name, you can tell, traditionally linked to the appreciation of Buddhist doctrine, Buddhist philosophy, you might say, Buddhist psychology, if you can use that term for Abhidhamma. So it's linked to a particular, you might say, way of understanding the nature of experience, the experience in this case of the personal self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that brings up the point too that you raised, that especially when it comes to language. I know that's your love as well. It's just the nuances of how language is used.
Yes.
In different contexts. But what we've seen happening is that a lot of the psychologists that are writing about mindfulness, I mean, they're using the same terms. They're saying they're seeing things as they truly are, insight. They're using those same phrases.
Yep.
And so are they pointing to the same thing?
Well, okay. Let's be very specific.
Yeah.
since we're not dealing with individuals here, and looking at particular individuals who use those particular words at a particular context, we'll just take in general this phrase, for instance, seeing things as they are. Mm-hmm. That gets bandied around.
It does.
I was a couple of years ago at the big mind. What is this?
Mind and Life.
Mind and Life thing. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
The Mind and Life Summer Research Institute, and this phrase came up with all the cognitive scientists and psychotherapists who constitute the majority of the people who attend Mind and Life. And I was one of a handful, really 2 or 3 Buddhist scholars of Buddhism who were invited to attend as a kind of touchstone to the tradition, I guess. But anyway, this expression came up, and there was some speculation at the time about what it might mean on the part of I believe it was a cognitive scientist who used the term in his talk. And I remember after that talk, in the question and answer, I pointed out that you really there doesn't need to be speculation about that term. It's very precisely defined. Seeing things as they are means seeing that all so-called samsaric experience, that is the experience of an unenlightened being, you could say, is characterized by 3 marks, according to the Theravada teachings. And those 3 marks are impermanence, no self, and suffering. And so the whole point of insight, meditation, in the sense that we're just talking about it, is to see things as they are, which means to see that all experience all unenlightened experience, samsaric experience, is characterized by impermanence, no self, and suffering. It's not to escape from that truth, it's to see it. Mm-hmm. So if people are using that term correctly, that's the way it should be used. It has a very specific meaning.
In counseling and psychotherapy, it's clearly used in a different way. I mean, that's what you're saying. It's probably what you heard there. What it often refers to is, a student or someone will say, "Well, this is how I saw it," and the instructor or the teacher will say, "Well, you're not really seeing it as it is because you're bringing your own particular filter, your own particular prejudices, to the experience." So the idea is, if you're mindful in this therapeutic sense, you're going to be aware of, this person reminds me of my brother or sister, or I'm in a bad mood. I'm mindful of what's happening with me. So therefore, if I can let go of that, I can then see the situation for, quote, what it is.
Right.
And that's clearly a good example of how it's become hijacked in a sense, or at least been appropriate or used in a therapeutic way. Another example is, and I use this in counseling with mindfulness, and I'm very conscious of that. It's completely it's a therapeutic usage as opposed to a Buddhist soteriological usage in terms of a non-self. But one therapeutic use is when a student we'll talk about the kind of therapeutic use of mindfulness as learning to not take things personally. So in a very superficial sense, there's again, it's a kind of a degraded version of the deeper Buddhist soteriology of that there's really no self. But in a therapeutic sense of kind of getting through the day or becoming a better counselor or just a somewhat less suffering person, being on the subway or standing on a queue in a grocery store, you learn to say, well, that person bumped into me, how dare they? You get all irritated, and
right.
If you're mindful, you say, well, I don't have to take it personally. How do I know that they had me in mind, or do I have a permanent self? They don't say, do I have a permanent self that's being abused, but they say, well, I don't have to be attached to that feeling, or I don't have to, so I'd be so identified with that the way I saw things. I can step back and witness it and let go of things. So that's a therapeutic a kind of borrowing clearly. I mean, I'm clearly understand the distinction between the deeper Buddhist soteriological usage of it and the therapeutic, and that's exactly what's happening. I mean, it's and people don't make that distinction. I think that's the concern that Ron and I have, and that it's become degraded in many ways, and that's why we appreciate your article.
Yeah, the distinction you make is right on target, I think. It's a distinction between, like you say, a therapeutic use of these techniques and ideas and a, soteriological, if we're going to use that technical term. I mean, I hesitate to say religious use because the term is so troubled and freighted itself. So, but in some sense, it's a secular versus religious use of the term, even if we don't, go there. But the point is, there, from the Buddhist perspective, these techniques, the technique of vipassana, is much, much more radical than anything that is captured in the secular or therapeutic use of the term.
Yes, I definitely agree.
Yeah, I think that raises the issue that what we're seeing is the psychologizing of mindfulness, and I mean, there's been a lot of interest going back to Erich Fromm in the early '60s, all the way back when Fromm was interested in Zen, but of course now with mindfulness-based interventions, sort of becoming so popular that there seems to be this conflation that vipassana or mindfulness is, as it's practiced within, let's say, a psychotherapeutic context, is completely conflated with vipassana. And I mean, it seems like the aims are very different. But on the other hand, you hear people say, well, we're trying to reduce suffering, and we're doing the same thing.
Right. So what's the problem?
Yeah,
right?
what's the problem?
That's the pushback.
Well, here we go. Reducing suffering is one thing. Eliminating it is another thing.
Okay, that's a good distinction.
And within the context of samsaric experience, so-called, to use the Buddhist term here, there are all sorts of levels of suffering. Mm-hmm. For instance, there are heaven realms. I mean, these are mythological terms, you could say, if you want to, but they can be and are interpreted psychologically, I understand. But in the so-called God realms, according to traditional Theravada Buddhism, there's almost no suffering at all. I mean, in fact, the only suffering in the God realms, where beings who live there for immense periods of time and ethereal bodies that aren't subject to all the kind of problems of aging and sickness and so forth, and frailty in those terms, the only suffering in that realm is in the moment when these beings realize they're going to die. And that's in that moment, that happens just before they do die. The mythological thing is they begin to sweat, and they notice this, and that is immense suffering in that realm, but that's the only suffering that occurs. For long, long lengths of time, there's no suffering at all. The opposite is in the hell realms, where there's continual suffering. The human existence, however, is defined as a vacillation between pleasure and pain, joy and sadness. And so, reducing suffering is an entirely legitimate goal, even within the Buddhist tradition, but it's very, very distinct from eliminating suffering.
Right.
Use the word. Another problem is the term suffering. I mean, the Pali term dukkha and the English word suffering, I mean, they have to be carefully mapped onto each other.
Yeah. I think that when we get into looking at, I think you mentioned in the article that there have been some psychotherapists who have actually even said that vipassana can be used as a tool or a technique for achieving therapeutic goals. And I think that
There you go.
Yeah, right. And it seems like what really is going on here is that self-help or care of the self, the aim for practical benefits, it seems like it's all tied to servicing of the personal self, instrumental goals to make the self feel more comfortable, like we were just saying, reducing suffering.
Sure.
And this brings up the issue of, with the mindfulness movement being so popular, in some respects, some people are saying, well, Buddhism has finally come to the West. Look what's going on. We can declare victory. It's taken root. But so what's at stake here then? What's really at stake?
All right,
if the West comes to see mindfulness as attaining comfort for the self, which seems to be what the therapeutic application of mindfulness is, what's at stake?
It's a really good question, and I have a few ideas on that, but I want to backtrack 1 second before, so let's not lose that question. But it occurred to me a minute ago that there's another very, very important distinction that is missed in the context of Western so-called mindfulness practice. Mm-hmm. The term mindfulness, which is actually taken from sati in Pali, it's the translation, an attempt to translate that term, is distinct from the term vipassana. And it's interesting, mindfulness, the English word is used, whereas vipassana, sometimes insight meditation sometimes. But there's an important distinction there. Vipassana is insight, namely insight into the three marks that I mentioned a minute ago. The cultivation of vipassana is a whole other thing, the cultivation of insight. There are various techniques for cultivating insight. The main technique, or a main technique, I guess I should say, in the Theravada tradition is so-called, is sati upatthana, which is to say the setting up of mindfulness. So mindfulness meditation, so-called, is not synonymous with vipassana, insight. Mindfulness is a technique and insight for cultivating insight. But so mindfulness could conceivably be used for other purposes as well.
Is that connected to the idea that you're recalling or recollecting or remembering?
Well, that word sati, it has those overtones, smriti in Sanskrit, and it does, one of the ways in which the term could be translated in certain other contexts is memory and remembering. And specifically in this case, in this context, it means remembering the Buddhist teachings on no self and impermanence and suffering, and calling them up and using them as a lens through which to view experience. It's a particular way of viewing one's experience, and mindfulness meditation is a tool for doing that. But in that sense, mindfulness itself is more or less like a microscope, you might say, and the vipassana has to do with knowing how to prep the slides and get them under there and knowing what you're looking at when you look through the microscope. It's a particular way of interpreting what is seen through the microscope of mindfulness, vipassana. So in that sense, I think this goes some way towards addressing the issue that came up a minute ago. Like, people can say, I'm using mindfulness meditation, I'm reducing suffering. Well, yeah, sure, that's possible. As a technique, mindfulness can do the kind of things that you were talking about, Dave, a while back, about when somebody bumps you on the subway, you don't flip out, But that's still quite different from mindfulness as a way of cultivating insight, ultimate insight into the ultimate nature of things.
Yes.
I think that also raises a question. If we're trying to prepare those slides in order to know what we're viewing, we need some sort of, the view. We often hear that term, having the right view.
Right.
So even going back to the Burmese meditative tradition, when Ledi Sayadaw was modernizing and bringing it to lay people during that period of time, they were still valuing, from my understanding, scriptural study and intellectual learning, even among lay people. They were. I think the Abhidharma was one of the required texts.
Absolutely, and also they were valuing something which I know is an issue that concerns you greatly, and that is ethical practices. This was and that brings back to the question you asked: what's being lost here in America? And what's being lost is really easy to say in this context. What's being lost is the study of Abhidhamma and all the Buddhist doctrine and the appreciation of how that fits into the context of mindfulness practice. And the other thing that's being lost is the entire ethical teachings of Buddhism, the moral teachings, the so-called sila, a moral practice. Those things that were considered an essential frame, are considered an essential frame within the soteriological use application of mindfulness, ethical practice, and the doctrinal teachings of impermanence, no self, and suffering, those kinds of things. Those are the things that are largely being lost in favor of a kind of bare bones teaching about how to focus the mind and how to kind of step back from one's experience in a certain way and gain a certain impartiality that allows you not to flip out on the subway.
Right. And Ron has written extensively on this. I've written somewhat. I mean, that's the heart of what we've been concerned about. It's become severed from its and disembedded from its context. It's not an ethical or moral practice, and so therefore it's run amok. It's used in the military, in the corporations, and in other questionable realms in education, and it's become a technology of the self, and that's part of what we're concerned about.
Absolutely. Well, it's not one of the things no one's mentioned yet, but it's behind a lot of this conversation is the culture that we live in.
Yes.
Not only has no appreciation for, that's a bit of hyperbole.
Yeah.
It's a highly secularized culture, which focuses on the self. And I mean, I teach at a college, and I know, students are encouraged, young people are encouraged to think in terms of what can I achieve in life, and what do I want in life, and how do I go about achieving my aims in life, and so forth and so on. I mean, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. It's essential at one level, but it is not at the soteriological level. This focus on the self, which is the center of our secular culture, is a real problem because it brings nothing but suffering, ultimately.
Yeah. And you bring that up in the article. This idea of this culture of self-help that we're in the West here, because why sit? Why do all this mindfulness practice unless there's something in it for me?
Yeah. What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? Right. And if you look at the popular media, and it's the way it's portraying mindfulness, it's always advertising what's in it for the self.
Absolutely, that's the selling point. That's the hook that gets people going. And to be fair, that's the only motivation for a quote-unquote unenlightened being from the Buddhist point of view. We're all only going to be motivated to some extent by selfish desire. And so, sure, you have to get people going by an appeal to their self-centered desires. But early on, within the Buddhist the context of, I'll call it serious Buddhist practice, it's traditionally been monastic practice, but as you pointed out, in Burma, Lady Sayadaw and the whole tradition that emanated from him made this into a lay practice too. But the focus was, once you get going, the focus has to be on the ethical teachings and the Abhidhamma teachings and the things that we've been talking about here. Otherwise, there's all that's left is the appeal to self-interest, and it's self-defeating. From the
that's a good counter argument to a number of arguments that Ron and I hear, which is and people have written about stealth Buddhism or the Trojan horse, that let's get a foothold into the corporations or somewhere, and so it's a beginning. You start with enlightened self-interest.
Dharma portal, right?
Yeah, it's a portal.
And when do we get away from the beginning? And
Exactly, and there's no evidence that happens. But the larger point is, it's not brought up as as anything to. It's not even brought up. I mean, the idea of letting go of the self is not mentioned. I mean, there's
the soteriological perspective.
Yeah.
It's reconstituted to be some form, as you've already kind of suggested, some form of an appeal to the self. What's in this for me? And that's the ultimate question, and the ultimate answer to what Buddhism is about must be framed in those terms. And there's the problem. Yeah. There it is.
Yeah, I think that you raised the point that, this is a highly secularized culture, and there seems to be almost a kind of an antagonism or mistrust, though, of traditional institutions in the West. And so traditional Buddhist institutions would be, part of that package. So it seems
Suspect.
Yeah. And so a lot of, we hear a popular trope out there that, well, Buddhism, it's always changed as it's adapted and moved from one region or culture to another. And so it's an adaptation to the West. It's no different. This is a way that Buddhism is adapting, and what's your problem?
From my point of view, let's just say, okay, fine, this is a way that's adapting, and who's to say? Perhaps in some fashion it is. No one can read the future in this respect. However, as you made one of the two of you made a point a minute ago, I mean, if this is the beginning, when do we get beyond the beginning? I mean, let's start getting beyond the beginning. Let's start moving into some new territory here. If we're actually adapting, then let's start adapting.
Yeah.
I mean, how long do we wait? I think. So I think there's a way of reconciling, from a certain perspective, for the people who say this is the way Buddhism gets a toehold. Okay, fair enough. But that means that if it's going to be anything ever but a toehold, it's some really dumbed-down form of Buddhism that completely discounts the soteriological perspective and all the teachings of Abhidhamma and the ethical teaching, then we need to do what you're doing, which is find a way to point out the superficiality of this constant appeal to the self. Mm-hmm. There's one other thing that might be relevant that I didn't mention in the article, but I think it's highly relevant to this conversation, and that is, it's in Mahayana Buddhism, it's a bit more forefronted, but it's every bit in Theravada as well. There's a traditional equation that's established between wisdom, what's called wisdom, which is essentially the same as vipassana. Wisdom is the insight into reality as it is in the terms we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. And that's called prajna in Sanskrit, panya in Pali. And karuna, which is normally translated as compassion. Mm-hmm. But what karuna is it's the way a person who's no longer focused on the self relates to others. And so the English word compassion is fine. Love might be another. But it's the natural outgrowth of understanding or wisdom in Buddhist terms. In other words, when I clearly see and understand that I don't exist as an individual in the way I thought I did, when I really understand that, the mark of that understanding is compassion for others.
I would think, especially because at that point there's no fundamental distinction between I as a self and you and others. I mean, there's no that. I mean, but so that would follow. And I just want to quickly say, I mean, again, a kind of a misuse or a degradation of this use in education and psychology in terms of social emotional learning. Compassion is a huge buzzword now in schools.
Self-compassion, yeah.
Well, right. Not just self-compassion, but also being kind to others and in terms
in school.
Interpersonal skills and again it's not a bad thing, but to see it in the larger context of what that really means is a whole other story.
And that's why, I mean, that's an argument for doing what the Buddhist tradition has traditionally done, and that is to put teachings on compassion, ethical teachings, right up front, not to wait until some unspecified insight comes at some, future date or whatever. But to say right from the beginning that if you really understand what's being taught here, then you understand that it means feeling compassion and acting with compassion for the people around you. And if you don't understand that from the beginning, then your motivation from the beginning is wrong, and you need to come to grips with that.
I know what I was going to say. There are people that somehow skip that level. In other words, they think, well, by meditating, by being mindful, you're going to automatically be compassionate, and you're going to have this.
That's not what the tradition has ever said.
Exactly. And so, but there are people that say that in secular terms.
Yes,
and
there are.
And they skip over the idea that there's still skillful ways to do. You still have to sort of know what that means in a skillful way. I mean, there's a kind of a middle range where, if you meditate and you're mindful, you're going to automatically be compassionate towards people. I mean, it's a very superficial jump.
Without getting into a big dispute about whether or not such a thing is possible, I think that the evidence from the Buddhist tradition is, first of all, that has never been the teaching. The ethical teachings have always been up front, along with the Abhidharma teachings, along with these practices. But also, that is, if it can occur, it's probably a relatively rare occurrence. And in traditional Buddhist terms, they'd probably say, well, that has to do with past lives. People did all sorts of work in past lives, and they were primed, for that kind of an insight and that kind of a understanding of compassion. For the vast majority of us, for whom the Buddhist path is tailored, the teachings on ethics have to be given in the beginning, because people, they don't come naturally to self-centered people. I mean, right. And one of the ways in which we break down our self-centeredness is by being encouraged by the tradition to begin to extend ourselves towards others in terms not exclusively defined by selfishness.
See, again, that easily gets co-opted in terms of, like in Ron's field, in terms of corporate management. Well, a better worker is somebody that's collaborative and is more empathic, and that might improve the work climate and productivity or so on. I mean, that's...
See, what I don't get about this is, and I do get it at one level, but at another level, for the people who say that Buddhism, for instance, this is all going to work out, I don't understand, well, why not just say, from the corporate point of view, let's just start saying, okay, we're going to teach so-called mindfulness meditation, and we're also going to say, encourage you to be more compassionate now, not wait for mindfulness to solve all your problems, but just start right now. Let's find ways to encourage ethical, compassionate behavior now. Why do we have to wait until mindfulness makes it magically appear some day in the future?
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the claims, is that by engaging in mindfulness practice, the ethics are built into the practice. That's something that we hear all the time.
Right.
Yeah, yes, that's a real problem.
Well, they are built into the practice if mindfulness is harnessed to the cultivation of insight in the terms we've been talking about it. But when you leave out all the, not only the ethical dimensions of the tradition, but also the intellectual or psychological Abhidhamma, then you're really stripping out a lot of what would ultimately, hopefully, direct people towards more compassionate behavior. I mean, you're hanging everything on a particular technique. It's almost as if you use my microscope simile of a while back and say, well, we'll just turn the kids loose in the lab with microscopes, and we'll give them some rudimentary instructions on how to use the microscope, and we'll just hope that by peering into the microscope at the slide long enough, they'll figure out what they're looking at, you know?
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, the Buddha did this on his own, supposedly. But the tradition and the teachings that he passed down were designed to help those of us who are, not able to do this so easily on our own.
I think there's a dilemma in public education around secular ethics. If you're not allowed to talk about religion or a foundation of moral principles, where do they come from? So then they end up coming from not very questionable realms. I mean, social emotional learning is supposed to be scientifically based, and it has to do with compassion, but it's very superficial. And there's people are floundering for a kind of a secular ethics for kids. It's really
that's right. That's right. Well, I guess the idea is here that maybe someday we'll just get a pill and we can just take it.
Well,
and
there's
we'll
actually
all
a book.
love each other.
There's actually a book out there called The Buddha Pill,
Yep.
which is actually a critique of.
Why bother sitting meditation? It's hard. It's difficult. It takes time. Just get a pill.
Well, maybe we can end on a note of what would be your call to action here, perhaps for Buddhist scholars or anyone regarding the issues we talked about today.
Well, my immediate considered response on that, I think I do recall putting something like this at the end of the article, and I did say that I didn't actually say it myself. I remember quoting, and I'm forgetting at the moment who it was.
Oh, I think it was Metcalf.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you want me to read that quote?
Sure.
Yeah. In any case, Metcalf follows his question with a direct appeal to academic Buddhologists. Quote, the partial or distorted views of psychologist practitioners are a clear call for the Academy to do its duty and inform the larger public. Such duties are the raison d'etre of scholars of religion. In this case, can aid not only society's understanding of Buddhism, but Buddhists' understanding of their own traditions.
There you go.
So, do you have any more to add to that, or?
Well, insofar as I've written on this, I've written from a scholarly point of view, and I did that article and placed it in a scholarly journal where it reaches that audience.
Right.
As I think you know, I've also written. I published an article in Tricycle this fall, and really that article in Tricycle was a non-scholarly version of this article. And
do you recall the title of that?
What was the title of that article?
I think it was just in the last issue.
The Three Marks. I think they called it the Three Marks.
The Three Marks, yeah. I think that was in the most recent Tricycle issue.
It's in the most recent Tricycle. It's in the current issue. I mean, I as a writer, which is basically what I am. I mean, I write. And that's what I do, and I just try to as clearly as I can do the kind of thing we've been doing here. Just talk this through and try to clarify the issues around it. But there's a lot of other things that, well, you yourself have done similar work, and I don't see what else I can do now, but try to clarify the issues in writing, in conversation, and then go forward and see where we go.
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. Well, we've really appreciated this interview, Sandy, and maybe we'll have you back on as time goes on. But for now, we'll say thank you. We've been talking with C.W. Huntington, Sandy Huntington, Buddhist scholar at Hartwick College, and this is the end of our episode. We've been speaking with C.W. Huntington, Jr. He translates and interprets Sanskrit and Tibetan text. He is chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Hartwick College and author of the recent novel Maya. He's also written The Emptiness of Emptiness, an introduction to the Early Indian Madhyamaka, as well as a number of scholarly articles on Buddhist doctrine and practice. Sandy Huntington is particularly interested in exploring new avenues for the translation of ideas and practices of Asian Buddhism into a modern Western idiom. You can view his website, cwhuntingtonjr.com. You've been listening to The Mindful Cranks.